All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. It's the connection between, well, having kids and political leanings in Europe. So where are we getting all this from? Well, we found this lively Reddit thread. It's a reaction to an article from sciscipost.org, and the article is called Demographic Differences in Fertility Linked to Generational Shifts in the Political Landscape. Get ready. It's going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think it really highlights how, individual decisions, things like family size,
Yeah.
can really kind of have this ripple effect, and it can actually influence the political landscape in ways that, we might not even realize. This study, what they found was it's a pretty strong pattern that conservatives in Europe are having more children, and because of that, more grandchildren than liberals. And this isn't just a one-time thing. It seems like this pattern is actually holding true across multiple generations.
Yeah, that's the part that I thought was really interesting. Like the fact that it's multi-generational. It's not just like a blip. The study found that, for example, in Germany and France, the percentage of young people who say that they're conservative, it's jumped up a lot, like 8 to 11 percentage points higher than their grandparents' generation. What do you think about that? Does that surprise you?
It definitely makes you wonder about what could be driving that kind of shift. The study itself, and actually some of the comments on Reddit too, they pointed to a couple of possible explanations. One of them is that there's this emphasis on traditional family values, which is often associated with more conservative viewpoints. So if having a large family is something that is seen as desirable, then it kind of makes sense that you'd see those values reflected in the demographics.
Yeah. But then it makes you think about like, okay, so then what about liberal individuals? Do they maybe prioritize other things, like maybe career aspirations or just more personal autonomy instead of having a big family? Is that maybe part of this whole equation?
Yeah, it's possible. The emphasis on individual choice and being able to decide things for yourself, that's often associated with a more liberal viewpoint. And so that might mean people end up making different family planning decisions. But it's important to remember that, that's just one piece of this really complex puzzle.
Right. It's not like it's the one and only thing. There's a lot of other factors too. In fact, on Reddit, I saw a lot of people bringing up religion, and they were saying that a lot of religions, they encourage having larger families.
Yeah, that's a great point. It adds another layer to the whole conversation. If religiosity tends to be more common among people who are conservative, and if those religious doctrines are saying, hey, you should have lots of kids, then that could be a really big factor in this whole demographic trend we're seeing. It just shows how, how interconnected all of this can be.
It's like this web of all these different influences. And then somebody else on Reddit, they said, maybe conservatives are just more financially secure. Like maybe they're just better off. And because of that, they can afford to have larger families. Does the study say anything about that?
So the study itself didn't really address socioeconomic factors directly, but it's definitely an interesting point to think about. Could financial stability, could that actually be a factor in family size decisions? And then how does that tie back into the bigger picture of how society is structured?
Oh, that's a really good question. Like if this difference in how many kids people are having is happening, consistently, generation after generation, what does that mean in the long run for politics? Like, is it actually going to have a big impact? It seems like the researchers think that it is.
Yeah, they do. One of the researchers even said, and I'm just going to quote them here, demographics and the different fertility rates of left-wing versus right-wing individuals are important to understanding long-term political trends, and that the rise of right-wing party individuals we are currently seeing is also a consequence of demographics.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. They're basically saying that the future of politics,
Yeah.
it might actually depend on who's having more babies today.
Yeah.
Now, did you see the Reddit thread? People were bringing up that movie Idiocracy, where it's like the less intelligent people, they end up having more kids than everyone else. And then society kind of like, I don't know, dumbs down over time.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. And I mean, Idiocracy, it's a comedy, it's satire, obviously, but it does kind of tap into this fear that some people have about demographic shifts. It's interesting that the study sparked that kind of reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting how a study like this, it can really kind of touch a nerve, like it's poking at something deeper. One thing that I noticed, though, is that this pattern, it's not like universal.
Yeah.
The study actually specifically mentioned Israel as an exception.
Right. In Israel, it's actually the opposite. It's the left-leaning individuals who have higher fertility rates. And the researchers think that that might be because of Israel's specific cultural and religious context.
That is really interesting. I guess it just goes to show there's always more to the story than just, simple generalization. It makes you wonder, What other factors might be at play here that this study didn't really cover?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, another thing the study mentioned was that this conservative fertility advantage, it actually wasn't there in earlier generations. Like, if you look at the grandparents of this generation, it wasn't happening. It seems like it's a pretty recent development.
So what changed? Like what happened in the last few decades that might have caused this shift?
That's the big question, isn't it? Did something happen that made having a lot of kids, like, less appealing or maybe even just less attainable for people who lean liberal?
Yeah, exactly. Like, were there any ideas floating around in the Reddit thread about what might have caused this? I bet people had some pretty strong opinions.
Oh, there were tons of ideas being thrown around. Some people were saying, maybe it's the cost of living, especially in cities where a lot of people tend to have more liberal viewpoints. Raising a big family, it costs a lot of money, so maybe those economic realities are having an impact.
That makes sense. Like, if you're having a hard time just paying your bills, maybe having a big family just isn't, realistic.
Right. And then there's also the whole thing about, like, social norms
Mm.
and how what people expect in terms of family size has changed. In the past, having a big family, that was normal. It didn't really matter what your political views were. But maybe as society has changed, those expectations have changed too.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, maybe smaller families have become more acceptable or even desirable in some groups of people. And maybe that ties back into what we were talking about before, about people wanting to focus more on individual achievements and careers.
It's a really interesting thought. Like, could it be that in some situations now, having a big family, maybe that's seen as something that could hold you back from achieving those individual goals? It's a complicated issue for sure.
For sure. Oh, and we can't forget about contraception. Like birth control being so widely available, that's had a huge impact on how people decide to plan their families.
Absolutely. It's given people so much more control over their reproductive choices. And that could be a big part of why we're seeing this difference in family size between different political groups.
It's amazing how it's all connected, isn't it? Like from economics to social norms to even technology. It just shows you can't look at these trends in isolation.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes the study so interesting. It's not just about demographics. It's about understanding how all these different things are connected, like social stuff, economic stuff, cultural stuff, and how they're all working together to shape our world.
So where do we go from here? Like if this trend keeps going, what could that mean for politics in the future?
That's a tough question. But I do think it shows how important it is to understand these demographic trends and what they might mean. It's not really about trying to predict the future. It's more about being aware of the things that are shaping it?
Yeah, I agree. It's about being informed, being engaged, asking questions, and having these conversations about these complicated issues.
Exactly. And realizing that even choices that seem really personal, like how many kids to have, can actually have much bigger consequences.
Okay, so before we wrap things up, there was one more thing I wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
The researchers, they mentioned that their study had some limitations, especially in how they defined families. Could you remind us what those limitations were?
Sure. One of the main ones was that the data they used, it didn't really differentiate between biological and non-biological children. So, for example, a family with adopted kids would be put in the same category as a family with biological kids.
Ah, I see. So it's possible that the study might be exaggerating the fertility rates of some groups, since it's not taking those differences into account. Do you think they could have a big impact on the results?
It's definitely something to keep in mind. It would be interesting to see more research that really dives into those details and see if the same pattern still holds true, even when you consider those differences.
Right. It just reminds you, even studies that are really well done, they still have limitations. And it's always good to be critical of the data and how it's being interpreted.
Absolutely. It's all about asking the right questions and being open to changing our understanding as we learn more.
Well said. And speaking of learning more, you mentioned before that this study found this unique situation in Israel. Do you think that example gives us any clues about other things that might be influencing this whole connection between family size and political views?
That's a great question. The fact that in Israel, it's the left-leaning people who are having more kids, it definitely challenges the idea that this is a universal trend. It suggests that things like culture and religion might be even more important than we initially thought.
It definitely adds a whole other layer of complexity. So if Israel is different from what they saw in Europe, are there other places, other cultures, where we might see similar variations?
It's certainly possible, and that's why it's so important to do research in lots of different places. and to think about the specific history, the social factors, the political factors that shape each society.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, isn't it? And with every layer, we find new insights and more complexity.
I love that analogy. It perfectly describes how science works and how our understanding grows as we explore these fascinating questions.
It makes you wonder, what other onions are out there? Like, what other hidden connections and surprising trends are waiting to be discovered?
There are endless questions to explore, and that's what makes this field so exciting.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect place to pause for now. We've explored what the study found, we've talked about some possible explanations, and we've considered the limitations of the data. We've also touched on the bigger implications of this research and how important it is to keep exploring these ideas. But before we get to our final wrap-up, we have one more thought-provoking question to leave you with. It really makes you think, right? Like all these different pieces fitting together.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So the researchers mentioned this thing about how. This link between conservative values and having bigger families. It wasn't really a thing in earlier generations. It seems like it's something that's happened more recently. What do you think about that?
It is interesting, isn't it? Like something definitely changed in the last few decades. And it makes you wonder what those changes might have been. Did something happen that made having lots of kids less appealing? Or maybe just harder to do for people who lean more liberal?
Exactly. Were there any theories about this in the Reddit thread? What did people think might have caused this shift?
Oh, yeah. People had tons of ideas. Some people pointed to the cost of living, especially in cities, where there tend to be more liberal-leaning folks. Raising a bunch of kids is expensive, so maybe those economic realities are playing a role.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're struggling to pay your bills, having a big family might not be feasible.
Right. And then there's also the whole thing about social norms and how what's considered normal for family size has changed over time. Like in the past, big families were just the norm. It didn't matter what your politics were. But maybe as society's changed, those expectations have shifted too.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Mm.
Maybe smaller families are more accepted now, or even preferred in some circles. And maybe that ties into what we were talking about earlier, about people wanting to focus more on individual goals and careers.
That's a really interesting thought. Like, could it be that now having a bunch of kids is seen as something that could hold you back? If you're trying to achieve those individual goals, it's definitely complicated.
Definitely. And of course, we can't forget about birth control. Having access to contraception has had a huge impact on family planning.
Totally. It's given people a lot more control over when and if they have kids. And that could definitely be contributing to this difference in family size we're seeing between different political groups.
It's wild how everything's connected, right? Economics, social norms, technology. You can't look at any of these trends on their own.
Exactly. That's what I think is so cool about this study. It's not just about numbers, it's about understanding how all these different factors, social, economic, cultural, how they all work together to shape the world.
So looking ahead, if this trend continues, what could it mean for politics in the future?
That's a hard question to answer for sure. But I think it shows how important it is to be aware of these demographic trends and to think about what they could mean down the line. It's not about predicting the future, it's more about understanding the forces at play.
I agree. Being informed, engaged, asking those tough questions, and having open discussions about these complex issues.
Absolutely. And realizing that even personal choices like family size can have a ripple effect on a larger scale.
Before we move on, one more thing. The researchers mentioned there were some limitations to their study, especially in how they categorize families. Could you refresh our memory on what those limitations were?
Of course. One of the main limitations was that their data didn't distinguish between biological and non-biological children. So a family with adopted children would be in the same category as a family with biological children.
I see. So it's possible this study might be overestimating the fertility rates for some groups. If it's not considering those differences, do you think that could significantly affect the results?
It's worth considering for sure. It would be great to see future research look more closely at those nuances and see if the patterns hold up even when accounting for those variations.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that even the best studies have their limitations. And it's important to be critical of the data and how it's interpreted.
Definitely. It's all about asking the right questions and being open to refining our understanding as we learn more.
Well said. You mentioned earlier that the study found a unique situation in Israel. Do you think that example offers any insight into other factors that might be at play in this whole relationship between family size and political leanings?
That's a great question. The fact that in Israel it's the left-leaning individuals who are having more kids, It definitely challenges the idea that this is a universal pattern. It suggests that cultural and religious factors might be even more important than we initially realized.
It adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing. If Israel is different from what they observed in Europe, are there other regions, other cultures, where we might see similar deviations?
It's certainly possible. That's why it's so important to conduct research in a variety of different settings and to take into account the specific history, social factors, and political factors that shape each society.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? With each layer, we uncover new insights and complexities.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the essence of scientific inquiry and how our understanding evolves as we delve deeper into these fascinating questions.
It makes you wonder what other onions are out there waiting to be peeled. What other hidden connections and surprising trends are waiting to be discovered?
The possibilities are endless. That's what makes this field so exciting.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've explored the study's findings, considered potential explanations, and talked about the limitations of the data. We've also touched on the broader implications of this research and the importance of continued exploration and discussion. But before we get to our final thoughts, we have one more thought-provoking question to leave you with. Okay, so we've been talking about this study, family size, political leanings, all that. But what about the future? Like, technology is changing so fast these days. How could that affect these trends we've been discussing?
That's a huge question. We've talked about economics, social values, even birth control. But yeah, technology throws a whole other wrench in things. Think about like AI, automation, even the possibility of genetic engineering. What happens when those things start influencing how we create families? Or even challenge what we think of as family in the first place?
Whoa, it's like we're stepping into a sci-fi movie or something. Could AI actually help us make family planning decisions? Or even lead to totally new kinds of family structures? And what if, like, genetic engineering could influence political leanings? It's kind of mind-blowing to think about.
It really is. And it might sound crazy, but technology is moving so fast that these scenarios might not be as far off as we think. So how will these new technologies interact with the demographic trends we're already seeing?
That's a question that leads to even more questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about predicting what's going to happen. It's about recognizing that these powerful forces could completely change society in ways we can't even imagine yet.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these discussions now, to think critically about these technologies as they develop and to ask those tough questions. So we're prepared for what might come down the road.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. In a world where both biology and technology are changing faster than ever, how can we make sure that there's still a diverse range of viewpoints in the future? How can we create a society that's truly inclusive and represents everyone? Even as these fundamental ideas about family and politics keep evolving, there might not be easy answers, but it's definitely a conversation worth having.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about being informed, having open discussions, and being willing to consider different perspectives.
Well said. And that's a wrap on this deep dive. Thanks for exploring this topic with us. We'll see you next time. Keep those brains buzzing.